my pleasure to welcome you to Bloomberg San Francisco. A quick word about our offices here. Our operations have doubled in the last 4 years here in the Bay Area. We have 250 people here in the San Francisco office. We cover, on the news side, we cover everything from the technology industry, which is near and dear to my heart. We also cover out of these offices legal, financial services, projects and investigations, healthcare, and a wide array of other topics. This is also home of Bloomberg West, which is a television show devoted exclusively to the business of technology, and they recently doubled their daily show to 2 hours a day. So look for Bloomberg West. Now it's my pleasure and my privilege to introduce you to our distinguished panelists. This is probably the most well-traveled group of individuals you will encounter in quite a long time. To my far right, Nelson Mattos. He's the Vice President of Product and Engineering for Europe and Emerging Markets at Google. He joined in 2007 as Vice President responsible for research and development across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. His team works on a variety of Google projects, including the mobile operating system Android. Nelson also heads Google's efforts to bring cultural content online through Google's Cultural Institute, as well as driving internet adoption in emerging markets. Before joining Google, Nelson was IBM Distinguished Engineer and Vice President of Information and User Technologies. To his left, Katie Jacobs-Stanton. She's Vice President of International Market Development at Twitter. She's responsible for partnerships, driving user growth and other strategic efforts in markets across Europe, Latin America, and Asia. She formerly served as a special advisor in the Office of Innovation at the State Department and was Director of Citizen Participation at the White House. Katie, thanks for being with us. And to my immediate right, Rodger Voorhies. He's Director of Financial Services for the Poor Initiative at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He leads the foundation's effort to make high-quality financial services available and more accessible across the developing world. Before joining the foundation, he lived for almost 20 years in emerging markets and worked extensively in Africa and Eastern Europe to establish sustainable microfinance organizations. So please join me in welcoming this distinguished panel. Well, we hear a lot about these staggering statistics about the number of mobile phones that are being used across the world right now. I think the statistic that Cisco uses is that this year is the year that there will be more mobile phones or mobile connected devices globally than people on Earth. Those numbers are so huge, they can be staggering and hard to get our heads around. And what I'd like the panelists to do for the first question is discuss the demographics of mobile use around the world and in emerging markets in particular, and maybe address some of the misconceptions that we have about who's using mobile phones and who's benefiting from the spread of mobile technology. Nelson, how about we start with you?
There is definitely a lot of success stories, and we all heard about farmers being able to access price of products and being able to increase their revenue because of that, etc. And also in some places, mobile penetration has become very, very large. However, it's not consistent across countries. And many of the things that we take for granted here don't exist in many countries. Just to give you an example, I was in Somalia last year, and the different operators in that country don't allow you to exchange even calls between their networks. Which obviously forces people to carry either two devices or one device with multiple SIM cards. Similarly, the price of connectivity, as well as the price of the devices in these markets, is very, very high. Usually about 10 to 15 times than the price we would pay here in the US. And if you put, obviously, people's income into consideration, we are talking about 100 times more expensive than would cost for us here. This is obviously changing dramatically. Prices of devices have been coming down. Price of connectivity is also coming down significantly, but it's not like everywhere is a rosy picture.
I mean, in our space, we're particularly interested in SIM card penetration and handset penetration
down to low-income individuals. And one of the most surprising developmental stories of the world is the pace at which mobile technology has reached into the handsets of very, very poor people. And that, I think, is because most poor people live in pretty isolated lives. And so they have really deep, repetitive connections in very small geographic areas. And suddenly they have a much wider set of relationships that they can maintain. And that has all kinds of economic value to poor people. That has economic value in you have a crisis in your household, you can call a friend who's living in the city or a son or a child and say, look, can you send a boy on a bus to bring money because I have a crisis? It has an interesting effect when it comes to women especially, because women oftentimes are even more isolated than men in low-income communities. And so around the world, there's a real gender gap in handset penetration, or in SIM card penetration, rather. And I think the number in emerging markets is somewhere around 300 million women less have SIM card access than men do. And that gets bigger depending on the countries that you work in. And I think the larger gaps are obviously sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia for both cultural as well as for economic reasons. The interesting thing in our work, though, as you think about in financial services, is that in spite of the cost, in spite of the difficulty of being multi-SIMmed and multi-handset, low-income people adopt the technology really, really rapidly. So without huge multinational intervention, huge donor interventions, we've seen great growth in penetration. And that includes even into mobile money as well.
What efforts have you seen that are successfully making mobile technology more affordable and more accessible? What are some of the steps that either NGOs or other organizations have been doing? And is it time for a mobile version of one laptop per child, for example?
Well, I think we at the Foundation think that mobile handset penetration has gone pretty well. And where we think the cost structure could come down is obviously getting rid of a lot of closed loop, not interconnected systems, so that if people had some mobility from one system to the next, it actually becomes easier to switch, and that probably has market effects to lower the cost. I think that also holds true in the mobile money space, where we've had amazing penetration. 86% of Kenyan households use M-Pesa, and I believe that around 70% of those households are less than $2 a day in terms of the chief breadwinner. And we've seen similar kinds of growth in spite of the cost in countries like Tanzania right next door, where I think right now somewhere around 30% of people below $2 a day are using mobile phones for money transfer, compared to 15% who have a bank account. Now the really interesting thing is Kenya, you have a competitive environment. The transaction for me to send money from me to you is about 3 cents. That same transaction in Kenya is 30 cents, where you only have one provider. So I think competition is probably something that we'd love to see. And then the ability to move between one network and the other would be important.
Yeah, okay. Also investments on the infrastructure, on the network, right? In Africa, the prices were significantly high because there was one single submarine cable serving the whole continent. Basically no competition. As more submarine cables have arrived, both in the west as well as in the east coast of the continent, the prices have come down by very, very significantly. The other issue is related to the price of devices, but we should make a big difference between what type of devices we are referring to, right? 70% of the phones that exist, that are being used in these markets are feature phones. And are feature phones that are web-enabled, so you can access the internet with them. There is about 20% of devices that are not even web-enabled at all, so you can only do SMS and voice. Only about 10% of devices are the fancy phones that we are so familiar with, the iPhones, the Androids, etc. That is changing actually quite significantly, and the main reason the penetration of the smartphones have not grown faster than what we expected is because the price point is still very expensive, right? It has just reached below $100. And we estimate that as it reaches about $50, we should see a significant adoption across these markets.
And by the way, we want to hear questions from the audience as well, so we're inviting you to write down your questions on the blue cards that you found in your seat and pass them to the aisle. And just in a couple of minutes, we'll turn to questions from the audience. But I'd like to shift gears a little bit and ask about the role of mobile technology in helping to facilitate political change and really hold governments, for example, accountable and press for the kinds of change that we think would more readily foster economic development.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think over the past couple of years, we've seen almost an overemphasis on the role that social media has played in political changes. It's not technology, it's not social media that causes these changes, it's people. But the role that technology has played in places like Egypt and Tunisia and Libya even, are that you have people in an instant with over 5 billion phones on the planet, people in an instant are able to accelerate the spread of information. They're also able to connect across borders, geographic borders, social borders, economic borders, very, very quickly. And also something like, I think it's 83%, maybe even higher, 83% of all phones have a camera phone. So you've instantly enabled so many people on the planet to bear witness to what's going on in the world. They're able to shoot a picture, they're able to take a video and to share that so quickly that, that social and political changes just happen at a much more drastic pace than ever before.
Looking beyond the political and government transparency, I'm also interested in learning about financial market transparency and how mobile devices are giving entrepreneurs access to capital, to resources that they previously didn't. I don't know how familiar you are with the International Center for Research on Women has this anecdote of Sunita, this woman in India who is she's a silkworm grower, and she uses her mobile phone to get prices on cocoons. I mean, how widespread are we seeing stories like this? How prevalent is this? How accessible are these kinds of, this financial transparency?
I see examples of this in almost every trip I make. I have seen farmers in Zambia checking the price of tobacco across the border with Zimbabwe and Malawi to figure out, do I sell here or do I sell there? And in average, they have increased their revenue by 30%. I have seen similar things happening in Ghana, in Nigeria, in India, Southeast Asia, etc. So there is definitely a lot of that happening.
There's also a lot, in some ways we're seeing a real development of these markets. And in the beginning, it's voice, right? That becomes the most powerful connective element for low-income folks. And then it moves to how this information gets disseminated, as Nelson was talking about it. Great examples of people who know the price of fish in one port, and again, Zambia, Uganda, where they're sharing, or rather Zambia and Tanzania, where they share a lake, and the people are coming back with fish, and they go to one port versus the other because of the price differential they can see. And so that's always really dramatic. As that moves further, we actually get pretty excited in our space in financial services for the poor, because the poor, like the rest of us, suffer from all kinds of financial shocks. And what we've seen in some research recently in Kenya is that being embedded in a larger network where you can exchange money more easily had a real welfare effect. So poor people are not so statically poor, but they're rising and falling in poverty because of shocks or opportunities. And people who were a member of M-Pesa, in a large panel study by some university professors, found that people who were members of M-Pesa, when they had a shock, whether it was a crop failure, whether it was malaria or some other kind of small shock, they actually didn't have any reduction in consumption after that shock. But people who were a similar profile demographically had a 10%, somewhere between 6 and 10% fall in consumption. And if you're low income, that's the difference between kids going to school and not going to school. That's the difference between being able to not have to sell your goods that you're trading or keeping your goods that you're trading. So we actually think that this whole market with mobile has put a lot of power, both socially, economically, into the hands of poor people that they didn't have.
What about culture? I know that a lot of you, several of you, we've talked about the role that mobile technology is playing on changing culture. And to the extent that we believe that culture has an impact on economic development, why don't you speak to that issue a little bit?
Sure, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things we see, at least on Twitter, is that Twitter often reflects some of the things local in those cultures. For example, we found that many Latin markets in Brazil and South America and Southern Europe, they're very expressive, in person, but they're also very expressive on Twitter. So they create a lot of content on Twitter. We've also seen things like in Japan, where on New Year's Eve, traditionally people would call one another and wish their friends and their family, Happy New Year. But we see our records being broken every year on New Year's Eve because now people are tweeting to one another Happy New Year, and they can do it quickly to more people. And so we see a lot of that changing. And I think we also see too that as live events unfold, as a culture, we have this passion to know what's going on in the world right now. And it used to be this 24 hours news cycle. It's almost this 140 character news cycle. We demand instant news. You're here at Bloomberg, a place that really relishes on that. And I think what we saw last week in the very traumatic series of events that unfolded in Boston, people just kind of glued to their mobile devices to be able to consume this news in real time. So I think mobile has certainly enabled us to be able to access all of this information all at once.
And I think also mobile has given people affordable devices where they can actually create that content that in many cases reflect their cultural background. You see, and then combined with things like Twitter and others, there is then broad distribution of that content in ways that was not possible before. There is, for example, a very interesting startup in South Africa, Boza is the name, who has a program to give mobile phones to people in townships and have them record, right, music and any talent that exists, and actually spread that across platforms like Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and so on and so forth. And it's really becoming quite popular, and we see a lot of expats that are living outside of Africa consuming that content very heavily.
But a lot of these services that we're talking about, whether it's Twitter, Google, and a lot of these, they're available over the internet. And yet broadband penetration or internet use on the web, there's restrictions both financially and also governmentally. How much of an impediment to economic development are these restrictions that we see politically imposed on web usage, whether it's on your handheld or a laptop or nationwide?
Well, there are tools. There are tools. Twitter is one of the tools that you can use without having an internet connection. So you can send and receive tweets without having internet access. So we've worked hard, and I know many others have worked hard to make sure that their services are available with or without an internet connection. And one of the things actually, and not to go down too much the Twitter path, but I'm really proud of what the team has accomplished in terms of having partnerships with over 250 operators around the world in 100 countries, from Afghanistan to Yemen, to be able to send and receive text messages just like tweets, to be able to broadcast out information. And many of those countries are very difficult to operate in as a business, but it's important to reach every person on the planet for us. And I think you still see that there are countries which make it very, very difficult to operate and to get access to information. But information's like water; it has a way of finding its way out. Citizens in China will use VPNs in order to access all their favorite websites that they might be restricted against. And so eventually, I do believe that all these markets will open up and make it easier and easier for people to send and receive information.
I also remember that the access that you can have to information on the internet on a mobile device can happen through a mobile broadband, right? It can happen also via SMS and other types of protocols, which are completely independent from the internet infrastructure on their own. And like Twitter or Facebook, and Google has many products that allows you to interact purely on an SMS basis, right? You can send emails to someone by typing an SMS. You can receive emails by getting an SMS, and so on and so forth.
In fact, one other example, Google and Twitter had worked together in Egypt last year when the government had shut down the internet. And thanks to the Say Now technology that Google has, people were able to call a number from Egypt because the internet was dead, and they would call this number, this voicemail box in the UK, leave a message and say what was going on, and then that message would be automatically tweeted. So I think it was a really good example of how information can navigate its way out there. Great.
One question that I've already started receiving questions from the audience, and I'll intersperse them, but security, and we saw it today with the breach on the AP on their Twitter account. So the question relates to what are your thoughts on security and the ramifications of security breaches in the developing world, and to what extent is that an issue there in the same way it is, say, here?
So always have a great password, and not to comment on what happened today, but
I don't see a difference from a security perspective. I don't see a difference between what we expect here versus what people in the developing countries would expect, and I don't see anything there that makes it harder or easier for you to actually protect your data and the access from other people. So definitely it's an extremely important topic and one that a lot of companies are focusing and investing heavily upon, but I don't see a major difference on whether we're dealing with data sitting in the US or data sitting in Kenya.
I mean, for us at the foundation and the financial services side, especially when we think about mobile platforms, security is really important because it's people's money. And so part of our goals as we look at these platforms and think about what it would take to get them down into low-income people's hands, we have three big areas. One is robustness, and that's a lot on security. How do we get something that really is secure? Two, open. How does it open so that lots of people can access directly and lots of different kinds of products and services can reach the poor? And then third is obviously low cost. And so I think that in my last conversation, even with Bill himself, one of the big things he pointed out is let's make sure that anything we do has sufficient level of security so that poor people feel they can trust the system, because that's really what is valuable for the long-term growth of this market.
Sure. Someone in the audience, like me, is interested in the role that mobile technology is playing in helping us prepare for and respond to and recover from natural disasters and other cataclysmic events. Clearly, a big impediment to economic development is our inability to respond and be prepared for. So I think, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that topic.
we've seen great examples of how organizations, nonprofits, governments have been able to leverage SMS specifically to be able to respond in real time during a disaster. So in Japan a couple of years ago, when people suffered a terrible natural disaster, and people were able to still text in where they were, where they needed help. We've seen people being able to, in Haiti, when there was a cholera outbreak, the Red Cross was able to SMS out, here's what's going on, here are signs of cholera, here's where you can go find help. And we've also, and a third example is how organizations like the Red Cross have used mobile technology for donations. So in any type of natural disaster, your first instinct as you hear about it is, what can I do to help? And so many of these organizations have used partnerships with companies like Mobile Accord and mGive to be able to set up short codes where they can very easily text in a donation. So I see more and more of these organizations, both from sort of an alerting and a responding and a donation gathering way, leveraging mobile.
I mean, in our space, we've seen a huge shift in the last few years of trying to understand how they can directly deliver aid via mobile platform into poor people's hands. The requirement is people have to have a way to cash out, and that's one of the things that we're really investing in right now. But after the Haiti earthquake, Mercy Corps and others began to deliver aid via mobile devices, and the speed, I believe, was 2.5 to 3 times faster than what could be done with cash, which is a whole order of magnitude faster than what physical food aid would be. There's a great, I'm going to get his name wrong, there's a professor who's done some work that we have used in other cases up at University of Washington. I think it's Jonathan Blumenstock. Anyway, he looks at an earthquake in Haiti, and he, using geospatial location of where the mobile phones were, he watches who's sending airtime, who's receiving airtime. And then an earthquake happens, and it just happens to be he has the data to analyze around that. And so senders are blue and receivers are red. And the country's kind of evenly blue and red, going back and forth and flashing. And within a few seconds after an earthquake, the part of the country which had the earthquake suddenly became all red as receivers, and the rest of the country became blue as senders. So suddenly you have poor people solving their own problem in way faster ways than we could do from the outside.
I'm also interested in applications and ones that are relevant for emerging markets and developing world. We're kind of spoiled here when, in places where we have access to 700, 800,000 apps on the App Store or Google Play. But in researching this, a lot of people have lamented the lack of locally relevant and emerging market specific apps. So I'm really interested in knowing if there are startups or developers or your own efforts to make your apps and your tools and services more accessible and more relevant. So can you weigh in on that?
There is a lot happening in that space, and the problems are, I would say, from two dimensions. First, there is a lack of locally relevant content online to be consumed by everyone that has those devices. And we know, right, by looking at the types of searches that we get around the globe, that about 20% of all searches that Google receive are people looking for content that is locally relevant instead of something that is of global applicability. There are many initiatives to help people create online content. For example, only 2% of small businesses in emerging markets have an online presence. And these are businesses that have information about bus services, where do they stop, office hours of hospitals or doctors, and so on and so forth. So just bringing all of these SMBs online will create a huge amount of highly relevant content, and obviously will also have the benefit of helping them reach new customers, increase their business, and so on and so forth. Another very good example is the use of crowdsourcing. And let me use an example of a Google product. We launched about 5 or 6 years ago, a product called MapMaker, which is a product that any human being can take it and actually draw streets, roads, buildings in Google Maps. And the reason we did this is because about a third of the world at that time had no maps. And if you now go online on Google Maps, you will see a huge change from about 2006. We have about 40,000 volunteers worldwide that are creating data on Google Maps on a monthly basis. And to give you a sense of the volume of updates that they generate, every 2 weeks nowadays, we produce as much data on Google Maps as we used to produce in all of 1 year around 2006, before we introduced MapMaker. And so pretty much now, roads are everywhere, and constructions in these countries happen all the time. So constantly people are updating and making sure that you have the most relevant data available online.
Yeah, one of the things that Twitter has done is try to make, not necessarily creating local apps in every place, but try to make Twitter more accessible in every place. And so one of the things we've done is try to make it easier working with carriers in certain places to make it virtually free to be able to access. So that removing that friction of having a cost to access your favorite website. And so we work with carriers. In fact, today we launched with Reliance in India to make it just very inexpensive for people to be able to participate in the world's conversation.
Great. Someone in the audience is interested in the role of SMS. We hinted at that earlier today, and the question is this going to become more or less important over time, particularly when you talk about mobile communications in emerging markets?
Do you want me to echo it? I think SMS is here to stay, and this is probably a very controversial statement even inside of my own company. And we see this in places like the US, where smartphone penetration is very high, and the population in general are heavy use of smartphones, but the volume of SMSs have not come down. Because it's a simple, easy to use form of sending somebody actually a message. And we see no difference in emerging markets. Obviously there today, this is one of the main forms of communication. And many companies, as we mentioned before, leverage SMS as ways to interact with their own products. But even there, as the smartphone penetration increases and there is other means for people to communicate, they will continue to take advantage of SMS.
I totally agree based on foolproof science of having a 13-year-old daughter. And she has just skipped over emails. She doesn't answer her emails. I'm like, why didn't you answer me? She's like, well, you should have texted me and you send me an SMS. So if teenagers are any proof, I think it's there to
My
stay.
daughter's the exact same age, and I have a very similar experience.
So there.
Someone in the audience is interested in knowing the role that mobile will play in helping to achieve the World Bank goal of eradicating extreme poverty by 2030.
I think you should answer.
All eyes on you, Rodger.
Eliminating poverty by 2030. So, look, the story on global poverty is actually a pretty good story. There are less poor people in the world than they were before. And this is not a foundation point of view, but one of my personal points of view from living in Africa for a really long time is I think that there's some good empirical research that one of the things that drives poverty is this idea of being disconnected. And if you live your whole life in really repetitive, deep social networks, but you don't have a way to actually exploit different ideas, different points of view, and that's either both economically or socially, you really can get trapped in that. And I think that mobile is a key contributor to helping people achieve, be better connected, and do more. In our particular space, I think there are a couple areas that we are particularly excited about. One is that financial services are not hugely valuable in and of themselves. They're really valuable in protecting people against risk and giving them a chance to take advantage of opportunity. If you don't have a way to save money, it's really hard to buffer yourself against those risks. And what happens is you go deeper and deeper into poverty every time a risk happens. And there's a great example from actually the bank I started in Malawi where we digitized payments of agricultural proceeds. And farmers like me can't carry around their whole paycheck for a year because they get paid once, and they never had enough money for fertilizer. And by simply putting in money that they actually, using behavioral economics, opted out rather than opting in so that money actually went to save for fertilizer for the next year, they got a 35% increase in fertilizer usage, a 22% increase in harvest, and a 17% increase in consumption. So small changes to the ability of poor people to manage welfare shocks have big differentials over time and for them to take care of their own problems. So we think both the great information stuff that we heard earlier, also the ability to be socially connected, as well as both the economic impact of better prices, getting farm proceeds to the door, are particularly powerful in this space. Whether we'll eliminate poverty by 2030, there's a lot more that needs to be done on education, health, and vaccine delivery, we think.
Yep. And educate, I mean, you touch on education. I mean, we can have a whole panel on that. But one of our audience members is interested in the role of mobile in helping to spread literacy in particular, and the impact that mobile is having on educating children. Maybe you each could weigh in on that.
I see less the usage of mobile devices in that context, but what is called dongles, right? The little device you put on your laptop and use exactly the same wireless technology to access the internet. And you can see this being heavily used in schools in remote areas, or even some universities, where access to the information on the computers that they have in their facilities actually happen through wireless technology. And what that has enabled is also the creation of content, of educational content in the right language, with the right background, to be more easily assimilated by those kids. So definitely a big potential there.
getting back to a subject that we brought up earlier, and that's the gender gap. Are there interventions or strategies that can be employed to close that, specifically with regard to emerging markets?
I don't think we can generalize in emerging markets, particularly from that perspective, because the difference in the countries are quite significant. However, we do know, right, by reading the statistics, that there is a larger percentage of men owning mobile devices in these markets than actually female. And that's something that we all need to work heavily to actually change the picture. However, it's also important to note that mobile technologies is creating opportunities for women that did not existed before. One of the biggest eye-opening experiences I had was visiting some of the most conservative countries in the Middle East. And when going to visit universities, seeing that in computer science, there is more females taking computer science classes than male. And the reason is very simple, because they want to be able to take a job that they either work on an office or work from home. And when I visit Saudi Arabia, the number of female entrepreneurs that provide consulting to create websites, to do online advertisement, and so on and so forth, and do the whole work from home, right, is incredible. And these are opportunities that actually did not existed before.
It's funny, I was going to use Saudi Arabia as an example too. We saw a really incredible rise of traffic on Twitter from Saudi Arabia over the past year and a half or so, and we believe, we don't ask users for a lot of information, but we also believe that it's driven by, a burning, desire to, get connected and get informed, but also seeing more and more women on the platform as a way to be able to, share and express themselves without, any, risk. I guess there's always a level of risk, but be able to, very openly express their concerns, their goals, their ambitions, their dreams, and with one another.
I think in our space, we're significantly concerned about how we reach women and girls, because we think that they oftentimes are the poorest people in the community and the most excluded. And we do a lot of our efforts across health, vaccine delivery, education focused on women and girls. And I think in our space, though, what we would argue around the mobile device is that as the use cases and scenarios work for women, they find a way to get the mobile handset or get access to it in a way that works for them. And so 2 quick anecdotes. One was we were recently in Tanzania, and there was a savings group. And not every woman had an access to a mobile phone, but the group did. And so they took the PIN number for mobile money, and they divided up the PIN to 3 different women, and they each knew, a couple digits of the PIN that were required. And so they were using the handset in a shared fashion around what was traditionally what's called a rotational credit and savings scheme. The second one is that as these use cases go, women do adopt. And they tend to adopt slower, but they actually tend to adopt. And so I believe, and I'm going to get my numbers slightly off, I think around 15% of women in Tanzania have access to a bank account. But already over 30%, actually 35%, are using mobile money. And bank accounts have been around for a long, long time. Mobile money's been around for a shorter period of time. And so what we think happens is that as it becomes useful, then they find a way to get access. And so I think we need to get the right applications and the right empowerment strategies and understand kind of the human-centered design of this. But I think you'll see those numbers grow pretty dramatically in the next few years.
Great. As we wind down, there's a couple of people who want to know, who think that we're focusing too much on the positive of implications of mobile technology in emerging markets. What are some of the challenges? What are some of the problems caused by mobile technology in around the world? Does anyone want to weigh in on that one?
I can talk about the challenges, but I have not seen a bad effect of the adoption of mobile technology, particularly in emerging markets.
You brought 3 optimists to the panel.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, they're huge, huge challenges.
Yep.
But I mean, some of the Some of the negatives that are often brought up are, look, we're changing culture, you're imposing a new technology on a community. There are issues around privacy and whether or not this data now is giving access. But I think when you talk to low-income folks, what they actually tell you is the opposite. They're most vulnerable when they're disconnected. They're most vulnerable when they're not known. They're most vulnerable when they pay more for financial services, substantially more, because no one knows anything about them. We all get low credit, most of us, because we're good credit risk, and there's data that tells people that. And so it becomes it's a curve, right? If you're way there where people know nothing about you, you're really powerless. And mobile technology has been giving people a way to be identified and be known. And so for the most part, we think it's positive. I'm sure someone will have a story of negative, but for the most part, on the whole, I think it's been positive.
We've been over that. When can we expect to see a $10 smartphone? Any thoughts on that one?
I would really like that. So if you guys can...
I would really like that too, but I don't have a crystal ball. The challenge that exists is, even though the prices of components are coming down dramatically, we all smartphone users demand more and more from those devices, right? Which is forcing all of the manufacturers to have to use more powerful components to be able to keep up with the demand of the developed world. And that's obviously causing not so much prices to go up, but the downfall of the prices has slowed down in the last few years. So if we all would stop demanding new capabilities on our smartphones, probably the prices will come down much, much faster.
I think it depends on the definition. So, you know, there's a smartphone, and then there's probably a smart feature phone that probably does 90% of the same thing, and I think that would happen a lot faster. I mean, it could happen within the next year or two.
Rodger, this one speaks to you in particular, and the idea of access to credit. And you know, we've seen a lot of problems with microloans, right, and limits in terms of their ability to really alleviate poverty. I mean, has the advent of mobile technology, and particularly smartphones, has that changed the dynamic at all and changed the conversation around microlending?
So I think it's changed the conversation in that traditionally the first point of entry into financial services for poor people for the last 20 years has been microfinance, microloans. And what emerged really quickly was that poor people paid back these loans, and more people entered those markets. And there was a narrative around this, which is, look, everyone's going to be an entrepreneur, and that's going to create jobs, and that's going to have a poverty alleviation effect. And I think the empirical evidence just doesn't hold that up. And it became a real marketing issue about how we drive that. And I think there have been a number of studies that have shown that. On the opposite hand, it's too much of a jump to go all the way and say, look, financial services don't matter, because we can have Nobel-winning economist after Nobel-winning economist to say when the financial system messes up, it causes a lot of pain to a lot of folks. And I think when Bill and Melinda began to look at this issue and say, why should we be involved? What the data really tends to show us is that people need a variety of financial services in order to better manage their lives. And the economics right now just don't work for providers, and they don't work for poor people to do much beyond credit because the interest rates are high enough. And where mobile technology and technology's changed, we think, in the last 5 years, is that mobile handset penetration gives you a point-of-sale device in someone's hands that has the ability to both overcome the distance but also the asymmetries of information. And in doing that, we actually think that enables the economics to change enough to allow a variety of financial services to flow across those platforms. Great story out of Ghana recently where weather-indexed insurance was delivered, and this was not over a mobile handset, but just the fact that you could get weather-indexed insurance allowed people to adopt greater or more innovative types of seeds, higher-yielding seeds, put more into their land because they knew they had a bottom-side risk out of them. Well, it's still hard to deliver that. You deliver that with boots on the ground, but if you can deliver that electronically, you can get the cost of delivering that service into a packet size that poor people can afford. And so we think that we're not a micro-lending organization at the foundation, but we think we're trying to do a wide variety of financial services, and we're trying to drop that cost dramatically.
One particularly intriguing question is from somebody in the audience who works with refugee populations, who are frequently prohibited from accessing the existing labor markets and so turn to entrepreneurial activities. Because they're also often required to live in camps or other geographically constrained areas. They can't physically access markets equally with locals. How might mobile technology enable people who are geographically stuck in such ways and gain access to wider markets beyond their physical reach?
That's a great question. I don't have a great answer for you. No, that's a great question. I'll have to think about that. Because you have the complexity of refugee status is really hard about access. That's a great question. Thanks for whoever asked that.
Yeah. Business model for companies that do need to sustain themselves and are trying to provide these services in these markets. Can you talk about that? Whether it's Google, Twitter, or other businesses that are, that need to sustain themselves. I mean, can you speak to that?
From a global perspective, our business model in emerging markets is exactly the same as the business model in the developed world. As you all know, the majority of Google's revenue comes from advertisement. And just like a large enterprise here in the US use Google to advertise their products, you have enterprises in Africa, in India, and Southeast Asia that do exactly the same. Obviously, because there is less presence online, particularly from these enterprises, there is less competition. And consequently, obviously, the prices of space, let's say in the Google search results, tends to be cheaper in those markets, but that's just a consequence of the market dynamics.
And Twitter, very similarly, we derive most of our revenue from advertising, and the one thing with Twitter is we're basically born on a mobile device, and so it's really forced us to be a mobile, first company from day one, which is great. And so the mobile ads that render are ones that we get paid for. So it's early in our story. We're only about 7 years old as a company, so we're just starting to build our teams outside the United States, and still working hard to reach all of our users wherever they may be, emerging markets, developed markets.
I mean, in our space, we're seeing a huge amount of innovation, both in the financial service side, but also in companies that are now being able to use those payment services, because payments are kind of the connective tissue for all of us to exchange goods or pay our utilities. And so one of the problems of the economics of reaching poor people is that they want to deliver things in a big enough packet that's economical to do. So if it's, say, us, and we're going to Costco, and you're buying 20 tubes of toothpaste, there's an economic value to buying 20 tubes of toothpaste. But poor people like to buy things in small daily sachets, and you can't do that for lots of products. But if you can get the payment cheap enough, then that actually allows them to have transactions in smaller increments. So 2 quick examples. One is there's a company in Kenya, more than one, that's selling solar lighting. And there is an embedded chip into the light, and people pay as they go. And then when they pay off that light, they own it. Now, the cool thing about that is then it becomes a way that they actually accumulate an asset. So they can begin to accumulate assets based on usage in a way that you couldn't do before. And so there are a lot of companies, both in India and East Africa, who are able to take these payments and think of creative ways that they can reach people they couldn't reach before.
Can we reflect just in the last couple of minutes on healthcare? I know, again, it's one of those big questions. We could spend a whole hour on it. But just briefly, insofar as access to healthcare is also instrumental to economic development, how is mobile technology changing that conversation in emerging markets? Nelson?
I would say, based on my experience from all the areas, healthcare is the one that has benefited the most, particularly in remote areas. And there are lots of success stories. I have personally seen a piece of work done by the Grameen Foundation with mobile devices where they register pregnant women across the country through their mobile device, and these ladies receive on a regular basis either an SMS or actually a voice recording in their phone, teaching them what's happening in that specific phase of their pregnancy and what they should do. And obviously, is super appealing and heavily used in the country, and has the consequence that they have managed to build trust with these communities and start changing ideas and myths that are actually very damaging for an infant. And let me just give you one example that I actually saw there. In Ghana, women in the countryside believe that if the breast hurts, they should stop feeding the baby, right? When we know in the Western world that it's exactly the opposite, right? Because milk is being built in the breast, and the baby needs to take it. So imagine the consequences of a 2 or 3 day old child, right, being put aside and getting nothing to eat at 100 and plus degrees. What the consequence of that? And this is something that they actually managed to break that myth and say, no, that's exactly the opposite. You should feed so that pain goes away as fast as possible.
I mean, as everyone in the room probably knows, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is incredibly dedicated to health issues. And I think there are a number of different initiatives going on around the world of where mHealth is being tried to figure out what the scenarios are that work for women. But it even goes at some of the most basic level. As you know, polio is one of our biggest focuses for the foundation. And in northern Nigeria, we were using mobile phone data to actually figure out where poor people were. And that sounds like a really funny thing. It's actually, there's not very good data around the world of where poor people live. And so as you were able to get the data and use GIS and geospatial mapping, what we began to find out is there were settlements that weren't on any map. And by actually having access to the settlements, you're able to get workers out there to deliver vaccines. And so it's not just the end user use case, but there's actually at the government level and at the healthcare system level. Because once you have that information, then you know where clinics need to be. And so you have this whole density of diffusion of innovation, but also where you place key resources within a service area. So there's both the provider side and the user side.
Great, great. And I think in closing, I'd like to just ask, can you give examples of public-private partnerships that you see having a big impact in this regard? You know, particularly in an environment where maybe public spending and giving to less developed countries is really being reined in, cut back, given kind of the problems we're seeing economically and globally. A lot more kind of partnership and interaction happening between the public and the private sector. So can you talk about where you see that happening?
I've seen a lot of examples. I mean, one, prior to being at Twitter, when I was at the State Department, they did a really good job, I think, of working with organizations like Ushahidi to be able to support their efforts in the aftermath of various disasters, to allow people to use their mobile phones to be able to plot their needs. Here's, you know, where we need water, here's where we need supplies, and being able to foster that development so as a platform so people could participate. You know, they've also worked really closely with the Red Cross for, you know, the example I mentioned earlier, to be able to send and receive donations. So the State Department has done, I think, a good job in terms of building that kind of foundation and building that precedent of working with organizations.
Lots of usage in monitoring the results of elections, like we saw recently in Kenya, where mobile technology plays a big role.
I mean, for us, we sit in Seattle, so we work through partnerships around the world. And for us, what we're seeing is a greater and greater emphasis on public and private partnerships. Recently this year, we started something with other key players, Omidyar Network, USAID, Visa, and the Ford Foundation and MasterCard Foundation. Oh, no, sorry, they're coming in. And it's called the Better Than Cash Alliance, right? And basically what it says, it's a number of private sector and public sector organizations and now countries who've joined who said, how do we digitize delivery of services, whether that's conditional cash transfers, G2P payments, or other kinds of government payments, that can cut huge leakage out of the system and increase efficiency and access. And so you have this organization that's housed within the UN that has organizations like Visa, organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations, like USAID, who've all come together around a common goal. And we think that that model is having great effects.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much on behalf of Bloomberg and the World Affairs Council. This has been a really enlightening and illuminating conversation about the role of mobile technology. Nelson, Katie, Rodger, thank you so much for being with us.